Salem, Massachusetts had always carried the weight of its dark history, but nothing could have prepared the town for what happened on Halloween night, 1978. The ancient streets that once echoed with accusations of witchcraft would soon whisper about something far more sinister, something that would haunt the community for decades to come. The Hawthorne Elementary School gymnasium was transformed that evening into a kaleidoscope of orange and black decorations, paper bats hanging from the ceiling like omens of what was to come. Children ran through the corridors in costumes, their laughter bouncing off the old brick walls that had witnessed generations of Salem's youth. But among all those innocent faces, 2 would vanish before the night was through, leaving behind only questions that would fester like an open wound in the heart of the community. Amanda and Rachel Dorsey were inseparable, as most identical twins tend to be, but these girls shared something deeper than genetics. At 12 years old, they moved through the world as if they were 2 halves of the same soul, finishing each other's sentences, sharing silent glances that spoke volumes, and maintaining a connection that their parents often found both beautiful and slightly unsettling. Their mother, Margaret Dorsey, would later tell investigators that she sometimes felt like she was raising one child split into 2 bodies rather than 2 separate individuals. The Halloween party was supposed to be the highlight of their school year. Amanda had spent weeks perfecting her angel costume, complete with handmade wings crafted from chicken wire and white fabric that their grandmother had helped her sew. Rachel, ever the complement to her sister, chose to dress as a devil, with red horns and a tail that swished behind her as she walked. The irony wasn't lost on their parents, who often joked that the costumes perfectly captured each girl's personality. Amanda, the gentle peacemaker, and Rachel, the mischievous instigator who could talk her way out of any trouble. That evening, as Margaret Dorsey dropped her daughters off at the school entrance, she watched them disappear through the heavy wooden doors, their contrasting costumes creating a striking silhouette against the warm light spilling from inside. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would see them alive, or that the image of those 2 small figures walking into the school would replay in her nightmares for the rest of her life. The party was in full swing by 7 o'clock, with nearly 300 children from the elementary and middle schools packed into the gymnasium. Parents volunteered as chaperones, standing along the walls with plastic cups of punch, keeping watchful eyes on the chaos of costumed children. The DJ, a local teenager named Bobby Caldwell, spun records from his makeshift booth in the corner, the sound of Monster Mash and Thriller filling the air while dry ice machines created an otherworldly fog that rolled across the polished floor. But it was precisely this chaos, this perfect storm of noise and movement and distraction, that provided the cover for something unthinkable to happen. In a crowd of 300 people, in a building filled with adults whose job it was to protect these children, 2 little girls would simply vanish as if they had never existed at all. The first sign that something was wrong came at 9:30, when Margaret Dorsey arrived to pick up her daughters. She parked her station wagon in the circular drive in front of the school, expecting to see Amanda and Rachel burst through the doors with bags full of candy and stories about their evening. Instead, she found herself waiting in an increasingly empty parking lot as other parents collected their children and drove away into the autumn night. By 10 o'clock, the gymnasium was nearly empty, and Margaret's casual concern had transformed into something much more urgent. She approached Mrs. Henderson, one of the parent volunteers, who was helping to clean up the remnants of the party. The older woman's face immediately clouded with worry when Margaret asked if she had seen the twins. A search of the building began immediately, though it started as more of a gentle inquiry than a frantic hunt. These were 12-year-old girls, after all, probably hiding somewhere in the building, playing an elaborate prank or perhaps fallen asleep in some forgotten corner. The remaining adults spread out through the school, calling the girls' names, checking classrooms and closets and bathrooms. It was during this initial search that they made the first disturbing discovery. In the girls' locker room, hanging from adjacent hooks as if they had been carefully placed there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, were Amanda's angel wings and Rachel's devil horns. The costumes weren't torn or damaged, showing no signs of struggle or violence. They simply hung there, pristine and undisturbed, as if the girls had calmly removed them and walked away. But walked away to where? And why would they leave their costumes behind when they had been so excited to wear them? The questions multiplied with each passing minute, and what had started as a simple search was rapidly becoming something much more serious. Principal Edward Morrison arrived at the school within 20 minutes of being called, his face grave as he surveyed the scene. Morrison was a thin man in his early 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a librarian than a school administrator. He had been principal of Hawthorne Elementary for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he had never faced anything like this. The local police were called at 11 o'clock, and by 11:30, the school was crawling with officers conducting a systematic search of every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Detective Frank Caruso, a 20-year veteran of the Salem Police Department, took charge of the investigation. Caruso was a large man with calloused hands and a manner that suggested he had seen enough tragedy in his career to last several lifetimes. As the hours stretched past midnight, the search expanded beyond the school building itself. Officers combed the playground, the parking lot, the small wooded area behind the school where children sometimes played during recess. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no indication that the girls had ever left the building at all. The parents were questioned gently at first, as investigators tried to understand the family dynamics and determine if there might be any reason for the girls to run away. Margaret and Robert Dorsey were model citizens, both teachers at the local high school, active in their church, with no history of domestic problems or family discord. The twins themselves were excellent students with no behavioral issues, no history of running away or getting into serious trouble. As dawn broke over Salem on November 1st, 1978, the terrible reality began to settle over everyone involved. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't two girls who had fallen asleep in a forgotten corner of the school. Amanda and Rachel Dorsey had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their costumes and a community that would never feel safe again. The story made the front page of the Salem Evening News that afternoon, with the headline, "Twin Sisters Disappeared During School Halloween Party." The photograph showed Amanda and Rachel from their most recent school pictures, their identical faces smiling out at readers who were just beginning to understand that something evil had come to their quiet town. Detective Caruso established a command post in the school's main office, and over the next several days, he interviewed every single person who had been at the party. Students, parents, teachers, volunteers, even the teenage DJ who had provided the music. Everyone told the same story. They had seen the girls earlier in the evening dancing and playing with their friends, but no one could remember seeing them after about 8:30. The investigation quickly revealed how easy it would have been for someone to take the girls without being noticed. The school had multiple exits, and during the chaos of the party, it would have been simple for someone to lead the twins out through a side door or through the connected hallways that led to other parts of the building. The fact that their costumes had been found in the locker room suggested that whoever had taken them had spent time in the building, had access to areas that should have been off-limits during the party. This realization led investigators to focus on people who had legitimate access to the school: teachers, staff members, maintenance workers, anyone who might have keys or knowledge of the building's layout. But this line of inquiry led nowhere. Every staff member had an alibi, witnesses who could account for their whereabouts during the critical time period. The FBI was called in after the first week, bringing with them resources and expertise that the local police department simply didn't possess. Special Agent Linda Torres, a specialist in crimes against children, arrived from Boston with a team of investigators who began re-interviewing witnesses and examining physical evidence with more sophisticated techniques. But even the federal investigators found themselves stymied by the complete lack of physical evidence. It was as if Amanda and Rachel Dorsey had simply dissolved into thin air, leaving behind no trace of their passing except for those carefully hung costumes in the locker room. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers organized search parties that combed through the woods surrounding Salem, looking for any sign of the missing girls. Flyers with their photographs appeared on every telephone pole and storefront window. The local newspaper ran daily updates on the investigation, and the story was picked up by television stations in Boston and New York. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, the intense media attention began to fade. Other stories captured the public's imagination, other tragedies demanded attention, and the case of the Dorsey twins slowly receded from the headlines. The family never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. Margaret Dorsey would drive the streets of Salem for hours, looking into the faces of every child she saw, wondering if somehow, impossibly, she might spot her daughters. Robert Dorsey contacted psychics and private investigators, spending their savings on anyone who claimed they might be able to help bring the girls home. The school itself became a different place after that Halloween night. Parents were reluctant to allow their children to attend after-school events, and when they did, they stayed close, never letting their kids out of sight. The gymnasium where the party had taken place was eventually converted into additional classroom space, as if the community was trying to erase the memory of what had happened there. Principal Morrison struggled to maintain normalcy in the face of constant reminders of the missing girls. Their empty desks remained in their 6th grade classroom for months, their names still called during attendance, as if somehow they might answer. Eventually the desks were removed, but the absence remained, a hole in the fabric of the school community that could never be properly repaired. Detective Caruso worked the case for 3 years before his retirement, never finding a single substantial lead. The case files filled several boxes, containing hundreds of interviews, photographs, and reports, but no answers. His replacement, Detective Maria Santos, inherited the case and continued to follow up on tips and leads as they came in, but the trail had gone completely cold. The town of Salem gradually learned to live with the mystery, though it changed the community in subtle but permanent ways. Parents became more protective, more suspicious of strangers, more aware of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of their quiet New England town. The case became part of local folklore, whispered about in hushed tones, a cautionary tale told to children who might be tempted to wander away from their parents. But 21 years later, as the new millennium approached and the memory of that Halloween night had faded to a dull ache in the collective consciousness of Salem, a discovery would be made that would bring all the pain and fear rushing back. A discovery that would prove that some secrets are too terrible to stay buried forever, and that the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Carl Jenkins had been working as a janitor for the Salem School District for almost a decade, but he had never set foot inside Hawthorne Elementary until the day everything changed. The old building had been abandoned for several years, deemed too expensive to renovate and too historically significant to demolish. It sat empty, slowly deteriorating, while the school board debated its future. On a grey October morning in 1999, Carl received a work order that would alter the course of his life forever. The building's insurance company required a safety inspection before they would continue coverage, and Carl was assigned to check for structural damage and remove any obvious hazards. It was supposed to be a simple job, a few hours of walking through empty hallways and filing a basic report. But as Carl pushed open the heavy doors of the old auditorium, his flashlight beam cutting through the dusty darkness, he had no idea that he was about to uncover evidence of a crime that had haunted Salem for more than 2 decades. Behind the cracked mirror on the auditorium wall, something waited in the darkness. Something that would force him to confront not only the mystery of the missing Dorsey twins, but secrets from his own past that he had spent years trying to forget. Carl Jenkins had always been a man who preferred the company of shadows to the harsh light of day. At 43, he had spent the better part of his adult life working night shifts, cleaning offices and schools while the rest of the world slept. There was something comforting about the solitude, the way empty buildings held their secrets close, the way his footsteps echoed in hallways that would soon fill with voices and laughter and life. But Hawthorne Elementary was different. Even in the pale morning light filtering through grimy windows, the building felt heavy with memory, pregnant with the weight of things left unfinished. Carl had grown up in Salem, had been a student at this very school back in the early 70s, before the Dorsey twins had ever walked these halls. He remembered the building when it was alive, when children's artwork covered the walls and the smell of cafeteria food drifted through the corridors. Now as he walked through the empty hallways with his inspection checklist, Carl found himself remembering things he had tried to forget. The way the older kids used to pick on him for being too thin, too quiet, too different. The way he used to hide in the old tunnels beneath the building during lunch periods, preferring the cool darkness below to the harsh fluorescent lights of the cafeteria above. The tunnels. Carl paused in the main hallway, his flashlight beam wavering slightly as the memory surfaced unbidden. He had forgotten about those tunnels, forgotten about the maze of maintenance corridors and storage spaces that ran beneath the school like veins beneath skin. The other kids had never known about them, But Carl had discovered them during one of his explorations, back when he was 12 years old, and desperate for a place to disappear. The auditorium door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the vast empty space. The room was larger than he remembered, with rows of folding chairs stacked against the walls and a stage that had once hosted countless school plays and talent shows. But it was the mirror that drew his attention, a large rectangular piece of glass mounted on the back wall that reflected his flashlight beam back at him in fractured pieces. The mirror was cracked, a spider web of lines radiating out from a central impact point about 4 feet from the floor. Someone had tried to tape over the worst of the damage, but the adhesive had failed over the years, leaving curled strips of yellowed tape hanging like dead skin. Carl approached slowly, his work boots echoing on the wooden floor, something about the mirror making him inexplicably nervous. It was supposed to be a simple repair job. Remove the broken mirror, patch the wall, file a report. Carl had done similar work hundreds of times before, but as he began to pry the mirror away from the wall, his crowbar slipping behind the glass to find purchase, he felt resistance that seemed wrong somehow. The mirror wasn't just mounted to the wall, it was concealing something behind it. The first piece of glass came away with a sharp crack that made Carl wince. Behind it, instead of the painted drywall he expected to see, was a hollow space, a gap between the wall and the mirror that shouldn't have existed. Carl's hands trembled slightly as he continued to remove pieces of the broken mirror, each shard revealing more of the hidden cavity, and then his flashlight beam caught something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Wedged into the narrow space behind the mirror, covered in dust and cobwebs, and the accumulated grime of more than 2 decades, was a child's Halloween mask. The rubber face was distorted and moldy, but Carl could still make out the features of what had once been a devil's face, complete with plastic horns that were now brittle with age. But it wasn't just the mask that made Carl's hands shake as he reached into the space behind the mirror. Tangled around the base of the mask, as if it had been hastily shoved into the hiding place, was a piece of white fabric. Even through the dirt and decay, Carl could see that it had once been part of a costume, delicate and carefully made, with tiny sequins that still caught the light from his flashlight. An angel costume and a devil mask, hidden behind a mirror in the auditorium of Hawthorne Elementary School. Carl sank into one of the nearby chairs, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. He had been living in Salem when the Dorsey twins disappeared. He remembered the search parties, the police cars, the way the entire community had held its breath waiting for news that never came. Everyone in town knew the story, knew about the angel and devil costumes that had been found in the locker room, knew about the 2 little girls who had vanished without a trace. But if pieces of their costumes were hidden behind this mirror, then someone had put them there. Someone who had access to the building, someone who knew about the hidden spaces and forgotten corners that existed in an old building like this. Someone who had wanted to keep a trophy, a reminder of what they had done. Carl's mind raced as he tried to process what he had found. The police had searched this building from top to bottom after the twins disappeared. They had interviewed everyone who had access, everyone who might have had the opportunity to take the girls, but they had never found this hiding place, never thought to look behind the auditorium mirror. The implications were staggering. If these costume pieces were real, if they truly belonged to Amanda and Rachel Dorsey, then their disappearance hadn't been a random kidnapping or a crime of opportunity. It had been planned, calculated, executed by someone who knew the building intimately enough to hide evidence where it would never be found. Carl reached for his cell phone, then stopped. What would he tell the police? That he had found some old fabric and a moldy mask behind a mirror? Would they even believe him? Would they care about a case that had been cold for more than 20 years? But as he sat in that empty auditorium, surrounded by the ghosts of children who had once filled these seats with laughter and applause, Carl knew he couldn't simply walk away. Those 2 little girls deserved justice, deserved to have their story told, deserved to have someone fight for them even after all these years. He carefully extracted the mask and fabric from their hiding place, handling them as gently as if they were made of spun glass. The devil mask was definitely child-sized, and the fabric showed signs of careful construction, hand-sewn seams and attention to detail that suggested it had been made with love by someone who cared about the child who would wear it. As Carl examined the items more closely, he noticed something else that made his stomach lurch. The white fabric wasn't just torn, it was cut, sliced with something sharp, in a way that suggested violence rather than accident. And there were stains on the material, dark spots that had turned brown with age, but which Carl's imagination supplied with a much more sinister explanation. The rational part of his mind tried to find innocent explanations. Maybe these weren't pieces of the Dorsey twins' costumes at all. Maybe they were props from some long-forgotten school play, costumes that had been stored behind the mirror and forgotten. Maybe the stains were just dirt or paint, or any number of harmless substances that could have accumulated over the years. But Carl had been alive in 1978. He remembered the details that had been published in the newspapers, the careful descriptions of the costumes that had been found in the locker room, white angel wings with chicken wire frames, red devil horns made of molded plastic. And now, hidden behind a mirror in the same building where the girls had vanished, he had found pieces that matched those descriptions exactly. As he continued his inspection of the auditorium, Carl found himself looking at the familiar space with new eyes. The stage where children had once performed now seemed ominous, full of dark corners and hidden recesses. The rows of seats that had once been filled with proud parents now looked like the perfect place for someone to hide, to watch, to wait for the right moment to strike. But it was when Carl climbed onto the stage itself that he made his second disturbing discovery of the day. Built into the back wall of the stage, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a small door. Carl had to get down on his hands and knees to examine it properly, and even then he almost missed it. The door was painted the same color as the wall, with no handle or obvious means of opening it. But when Carl pressed against the door, it swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow passageway that disappeared into darkness. The air that flowed out of the opening was cool and stale, carrying with it the smell of dust and decay and something else, something that made Carl's nose wrinkle with disgust. This was one of the tunnels he remembered from his childhood, part of the network of maintenance corridors that ran beneath the school. But this particular entrance had been hidden, concealed behind a false wall that someone had constructed with considerable skill and planning. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide access to the tunnels? What could be down there that required such secrecy? Carl retrieved his flashlight and shone it into the passage. The beam revealed a narrow corridor that sloped downward, disappearing around a corner about 20 feet ahead. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and the floor was covered with a thick layer of dust that showed no recent footprints. But as Carl examined the dust more carefully, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The dust wasn't uniform. In several places, it had been disturbed, swept away as if something had been dragged across the floor. And leading away from the hidden door, barely visible in the accumulated grime, were what looked like scuff marks, as if someone had been pulled or carried down the corridor against their will. The smart thing to do would have been to call the police immediately, to let professionals handle what was clearly a crime scene. But Carl found himself climbing through the hidden door, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he followed the disturbed dust down into the tunnels beneath Hawthorne Elementary. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to walk through without touching the walls. The ceiling was low, forcing Carl to duck his head as he moved forward. The air grew cooler as he descended, and the smell he had noticed earlier became stronger, more distinct. It was the smell of dampness and decay, but underneath it was something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Carl's stomach turn. The corridor branched off in several directions, creating a maze of passages that connected different parts of the building. Carl realized that someone could move through these tunnels undetected, could access almost any room in the school without being seen. During the chaos of a Halloween party with 300 people crowding the gymnasium, it would have been easy for someone to slip away unnoticed, to use these hidden passages to take two little girls to a place where no one would ever think to look. As Carl followed the main corridor deeper into the tunnel system, his flashlight beam revealed more evidence of recent activity. Footprints in the dust, some large and some heartbreakingly small, scraps of fabric caught on the rough concrete walls, and in one alcove hidden behind a cluster of pipes, Carl found something that made him drop his flashlight in shock. It was a camera, an old Polaroid model that had been carefully positioned to observe the corridor. The camera was connected to a timer device, suggesting that it had been set up to take photographs automatically. But photographs of what? And why would someone want to document what happened in these forgotten tunnels beneath the school? Carl's hands shook as he picked up his flashlight and continued deeper into the tunnel system. Each step took him further from the safety of the auditorium above, further into an underground world that felt increasingly hostile and wrong. But he couldn't turn back now. Those two little girls had been down here, he was sure of it. And if there was any chance that they were still alive, any possibility that they could still be saved, then he had to keep going. The main corridor opened into a larger chamber, a room that had clearly been modified from its original purpose. The walls had been lined with corkboard, and even in the dim light from Carl's flashlight, he could see that the boards were covered with photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, tacked up in neat rows like some kind of twisted gallery. Carl approached the wall of photographs with growing dread, his flashlight beam revealing images that made his stomach lurch. They were pictures of children, some taken from a distance, others close up as if the photographer had been standing right next to their subjects. Some of the photos showed children at school, playing on the playground or walking through the hallways. Others appeared to have been taken through windows, showing children in their homes, in their bedrooms, in moments of private vulnerability. But it was the section of wall in the far corner that made Carl's knees buckle with horror. There, arranged in a careful display like prized possessions, were photographs of Amanda and Rachel Dorsey. The pictures showed the twins in their Halloween costumes, but they weren't the happy snapshots that had appeared in the newspapers after their disappearance. These were different, taken in this very chamber, showing the girls' faces twisted with fear and confusion. And in the center of the display, mounted like a trophy, was a photograph that would haunt Carl's dreams for the rest of his life. It showed both girls together, their angel and devil costumes torn and dirty, their eyes wide with terror as they stared directly into the camera. The timestamp on the bottom of the photo read October 31st, 1978, 11:47 p.m. More than 3 hours after they had been reported missing, Amanda and Rachel Dorsey had still been alive. They had been down here in this underground chamber, while their parents waited desperately at the school above, and police officers searched empty classrooms and playground equipment. They had been so close to rescue, yet impossibly far away, hidden in a place that no one had ever thought to look. Carl staggered backward, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had discovered. This wasn't just evidence of what had happened to the Dorsey twins. This was proof of something much larger, much more terrifying. The wall of photographs suggested that Amanda and Rachel hadn't been random victims. They had been targeted, stalked, chosen as part of a pattern that might have included other children, other families who had suffered losses that were never properly explained. But as Carl turned to leave, to race back to the surface and call the police, his flashlight beam caught something that made him freeze in place. In the far corner of the chamber, barely visible in the shadows, was another door, and this door was slightly ajar, revealing a passage that led even deeper into the tunnels beneath Salem. The smart thing to do would have been to leave immediately, to let the police handle whatever lay beyond that door. But Carl found himself drawn forward, compelled by a need to know the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. Because somewhere in the darkness ahead, the answers to questions that had haunted Salem for 21 years were waiting to be discovered. And Carl Jenkins, the quiet janitor who had spent his life hiding in the shadows, was about to learn that some secrets are too dangerous to uncover alone. The door beyond the photograph chamber opened into a corridor that felt different from the maintenance tunnels Carl had been exploring. The walls here were finished, painted a pale green that had faded and peeled over the decades. The floor was covered with linoleum tiles, many of them cracked or missing entirely, revealing the concrete beneath. This wasn't part of the building's original infrastructure. Someone had put considerable time and effort into creating this space, turning raw tunnels into something that resembled actual rooms. Carl's flashlight beam revealed that the corridor stretched much further than the maintenance passages above, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow the light entirely. Along the walls, he could see doorways, some open and others closed, leading to chambers whose purposes he could only imagine. The air here was different too, carrying scents that spoke of long occupation, cleaning chemicals, food, human habitation, and underneath it all, that persistent smell of decay that had been growing stronger with each step he took into this underground world. As Carl moved forward, his footsteps echoing despite his efforts to walk quietly, he began to understand the true scope of what he had discovered. This wasn't just a hiding place or a temporary refuge. Someone had created an entire underground facility beneath Hawthorne Elementary, a network of rooms and corridors that could house people for extended periods. The implications were staggering and horrifying. The first room Carl examined had clearly been set up as some kind of office. A metal desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with papers and files that had been carefully organized despite their age. Carl approached cautiously, his flashlight revealing documents that made his hands tremble as he read them. There were school records, detailed information about students and their families, schedules and routines that had been meticulously tracked and recorded. But it wasn't just information about current students. Carl found files dating back decades, detailed dossiers on children who had attended Hawthorne Elementary going back to the 1960s. Each file contained photographs, both official school pictures and candid shots, that had clearly been taken without the subject's knowledge. There were notes about the children's habits, their fears, their family situations, their vulnerabilities. And there, in a folder marked with careful handwriting, Carl found the complete file on Amanda and Rachel Dorsey. The documentation was exhaustive, including not just school records but photographs taken over a period of months leading up to their disappearance. Pictures of them walking home from school, playing in their backyard, sitting by their bedroom windows. Someone had been watching the twins for a long time before that Halloween night, studying them, planning, preparing for the moment when they could be taken. The file contained detailed floor plans of the Dorsey family home, including notations about which windows were typically left unlocked and what time the parents usually went to bed. There were psychological profiles of both girls, noting Amanda's tendency to trust adults and Rachel's protective instincts toward her sister. Every piece of information had been gathered with the cold precision of a predator studying its prey. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the handwritten notes scattered throughout the file, observations written in a careful script that revealed the twisted psychology of whoever had compiled this information. The writer had noted Amanda's angelic nature and Rachel's defiant spirit, describing them as perfect complements who would provide excellent research opportunities. Research. The word made Carl's stomach churn as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't the work of someone who had simply wanted to harm children. This was something far more systematic, more calculated. Someone had been using these underground chambers to conduct some kind of twisted experiments or studies, using kidnapped children as subjects. The next room Carl entered confirmed his worst fears. It had been set up as a medical facility of sorts, with examination tables, cabinets full of supplies, and equipment that looked disturbingly professional. But the instruments weren't arranged like those in a doctor's office. Everything was positioned for observation, for documentation, for procedures that Carl's mind refused to fully contemplate. On a shelf near the examination table, Carl found a series of notebooks filled with detailed records. The handwriting was the same as that in the files upstairs, but the content was far more disturbing. These were observational notes, clinical descriptions of procedures and experiments that had been performed on children over a period of several years. The entries were dated, creating a timeline of horror that stretched back to the early 1970s. Carl recognized some of the names from missing person cases that had made the local news over the years. Children who had disappeared from Salem and the surrounding communities, cases that had gone cold when investigators couldn't find any leads or evidence. But they hadn't simply vanished. They had been brought here, to these underground chambers, where they had become subjects in some kind of twisted research project. The notebook entries described their reactions to various stimuli, their behavior under stress, their responses to isolation and fear. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that Carl was reading about systematic torture and abuse carried out over a period of decades. And there, near the end of one notebook, Carl found entries dated October 31st and November 1st, 1978. The observations about Amanda and Rachel Dorsey were written in the same dispassionate tone as all the others, describing their initial fear, their attempts to comfort each other, their gradual realization that no rescue was coming. The final entry about the twins was dated November 15th, 1978, more than 2 weeks after their disappearance. It was brief, noting only that subjects have been transferred to permanent storage pending further analysis. The cold euphemism couldn't hide the terrible truth that Carl was beginning to understand. Permanent storage. Carl forced himself to continue exploring the underground facility, even though every instinct screamed at him to flee, to run back to the surface and never look back. But he owed it to Amanda and Rachel, to all the children whose names filled those horrible notebooks, to find out what had happened to them. The corridor led to several more rooms, each revealing new aspects of the nightmare that had been operating beneath Salem for decades. There was a dormitory with small beds arranged in neat rows, each one fitted with restraints that made Carl's hands shake with rage. There was a kitchen area where meals had been prepared for the captive children, and a recreation room with toys and games that seemed obscenely cheerful in the context of this underground prison. But it was the room at the very end of the corridor that contained the most damning evidence of all. Carl's flashlight beam revealed what appeared to be a small theater or classroom, with rows of chairs facing a large screen mounted on the wall. But the equipment here wasn't for entertainment or education. The cameras, recording devices, and projection equipment were clearly designed for documentation, for creating permanent records of whatever had taken place in this underground facility. Shelves along the walls contained hundreds of film canisters and videotapes, each one carefully labeled with dates and cryptic codes. Carl selected one at random, dated October 1978, and found an old film projector that still appeared to be functional. His hands trembled as he threaded the film and turned on the machine, not wanting to see what was recorded, but knowing that he had to witness the truth. The images that flickered to life on the screen would haunt Carl for the rest of his life. The film showed Amanda and Rachel Dorsey in one of the underground rooms, still wearing their torn Halloween costumes, their faces streaked with tears as they clung to each other in terror. But they weren't alone. The camera occasionally panned to show other children, some Carl recognized from missing person reports, others who were strangers but who shared the same expression of hopeless fear. And moving among the children, directing them, speaking to them in a voice that was both gentle and utterly chilling, was a figure that Carl recognized with a shock that nearly brought him to his knees. The man in the film was older, his hair thinner than Carl remembered, but there was no mistaking the face of Principal Edward Morrison, the very man who had been in charge of Hawthorne Elementary when the Dorsey twins disappeared. Morrison, the man who had organized the search efforts, who had spoken to reporters about the tragedy, who had comforted parents and assured the community that everything possible was being done to find the missing children. He had been the one responsible for their disappearance all along, using his position of trust and authority to identify victims and carry out his twisted research project. The film revealed Morrison moving through the underground facility with the casual familiarity of someone who had spent years perfecting his operation. He knew every room, every corridor, every hiding place. He had probably been using these tunnels since he first became principal, perhaps even helping to construct them, creating his own private laboratory where he could indulge his darkest impulses without fear of discovery. Carl watched in growing horror as the film showed Morrison interacting with the children, speaking to them with the same gentle tone he had once used in school assemblies and parent conferences. But now that voice was being used to terrorize and manipulate, to break down the psychological defenses of children who trusted adults to protect them. The film cut to different scenes, different rooms, showing Morrison conducting what he clearly considered scientific experiments. He was testing the children's responses to various stimuli, documenting their fears and reactions, treating them like laboratory animals rather than human beings. And through it all, he maintained the same calm, professional demeanor that had made him such a respected member of the Salem community. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the way Morrison spoke to the camera, addressing it as if he were delivering a lecture to an audience of colleagues. He described his methods, his findings, his theories about child psychology and behavior modification. He spoke about his subjects with the detached interest of a researcher discussing laboratory specimens, never acknowledging their humanity or their suffering. The film ended abruptly, leaving Carl staring at a blank screen in the darkness of the underground theater. But the images continued to play in his mind. The faces of those terrified children burned into his memory forever. He now understood what had happened to Amanda and Rachel Dorsey, what had happened to all the missing children whose cases had gone cold over the years. Morrison had been using his position as principal to identify potential victims, children who fit his research criteria, and whose disappearances might not immediately be connected to the school. He had studied them, learned their routines, waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. The Halloween party had provided ideal cover, with hundreds of people in costumes creating chaos and confusion that allowed him to take the twins without being seen. But where was Morrison now? The man would be in his 70s if he were still alive, long retired from his position as principal. Had he continued his twisted research somewhere else, Or had he finally been satisfied with whatever sick knowledge he had gained from decades of torturing children? And more importantly, what had happened to the children? The notebook entry about permanent storage suggested a fate that Carl's mind refused to fully accept, but the evidence was mounting that Morrison's research subjects had never been intended to survive their captivity. Carl forced himself to search the remaining rooms, looking for any evidence of what Morrison had done with the children when his experiments were complete. He found storage areas filled with personal belongings, clothes and toys and photographs that had belonged to missing children spanning several decades. Each item was carefully catalogued and preserved, trophies from Morrison's victims. But it was in the final room that Carl made the discovery that would shatter his ability to ever feel safe again. Behind what appeared to be a false wall, his flashlight revealed a narrow chamber that had been sealed off from the rest of the facility. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the unmistakable smell of death and decay. The chamber contained what Morrison had euphemistically called permanent storage. Row upon row of small forms, carefully preserved and arranged like specimens in a museum. Carl's flashlight beam revealed the faces of children who had vanished from Salem and the surrounding communities over a period of more than 30 years, including Amanda and Rachel Dorsey, forever frozen in the costumes they had worn on their last Halloween. Morrison hadn't just been conducting twisted psychological experiments. He had been preserving his victims, creating a macabre collection of the children he had studied and ultimately destroyed. The clinical precision with which the bodies had been arranged spoke to the same obsessive attention to detail that Carl had seen in the files and notebooks upstairs. But even in the face of such overwhelming horror, Carl noticed something that gave him hope. The newest additions to Morrison's collection were decades old. Whatever had happened to stop Morrison's research, it had occurred years ago, possibly around the time of his retirement from the school system. There were no recent victims, no evidence that the killings had continued beyond the 1980s. This realization was both a relief and a source of new anxiety. If Morrison was no longer active, if his underground laboratory had been abandoned for years, then there were no current victims to rescue. But it also meant that Morrison himself might still be alive, living somewhere in Salem or the surrounding area, carrying the secrets of his crimes and possibly planning a return to his twisted research. Carl gathered as much evidence as he could carry, stuffing notebooks and photographs into a canvas bag he found in one of the storage rooms. The police would need documentation, proof of what Morrison had done, evidence that would stand up in court if the former principal were still alive to face justice. But as Carl prepared to leave the underground facility, to climb back up through the tunnels to the world above, he realized that his discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had Morrison managed to operate for so long without being caught? Had he worked alone, or were there others who knew about his activities and helped cover them up? And most disturbing of all, was Morrison's underground laboratory unique, or were there similar facilities hidden beneath other schools, other communities, where the same twisted research continued to this day? The tunnel system that Carl had discovered beneath Hawthorne Elementary was vast, with passages that seemed to extend far beyond the boundaries of the school property. Some of the corridors were blocked by debris or sealed doors, but others disappeared into darkness that suggested connections to other buildings, other parts of Salem's underground infrastructure. As Carl made his way back through the tunnels toward the auditorium above, his flashlight beam revealed details he had missed on his initial descent. There were ventilation systems that provided fresh air to the underground facility, electrical systems that had been professionally installed and maintained, water pipes that suggested the tunnels had been equipped for long-term habitation. This level of infrastructure couldn't have been installed without considerable resources and expertise. Morrison might have been the mastermind behind the operation, but he couldn't have created this facility alone. There had to be others involved, people with construction skills, electrical knowledge, access to resources and materials. The scope of the operation suggested a conspiracy that extended far beyond one twisted school principal. But who else in Salem had known about Morrison's activities? Who had helped him construct his underground laboratory? And who had helped him cover up his crimes? The answers to these questions were still hidden somewhere in the darkness beneath the town, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. Carl climbed through the hidden door behind the auditorium stage, emerging into the abandoned school building with his bag full of evidence and his mind reeling from what he had discovered. The morning sun streaming through the grimy windows, seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of the tunnels, and Carl had to squint as his eyes adjusted to the light. But even as he prepared to contact the police, to turn over the evidence that would finally solve the mystery of the Dorsey twins' disappearance, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that his investigation was far from over. Morrison's underground laboratory was just the beginning, the first thread in a web of conspiracy and horror that extended throughout Salem and possibly beyond. And somewhere in the town above, the people who had helped Morrison carry out his twisted research were still living their lives, still keeping their secrets, still posing a threat to any child unfortunate enough to cross their path. Carl had uncovered the truth about what had happened to Amanda and Rachel Dorsey, but in doing so, he had also discovered that the danger was far from over. Carl Jenkins sat in his pickup truck outside Hawthorne Elementary for nearly an hour, staring at his cell phone while the canvas bag full of evidence rested heavy on the seat beside him. The logical thing to do was call the police immediately, to turn over the notebooks and photographs and let the authorities handle what he had discovered, but something held him back, a nagging doubt that made his finger hesitate over the numbers. 21 years had passed since the Dorsey twins disappeared. 21 years during which Morrison had lived freely in Salem, respected and eventually retired, his crimes hidden beneath the very building where he had once been trusted to protect children. How had no one else discovered what Carl had found? How had such an extensive operation remained secret for so long? The answer that Carl's mind kept returning to was the one he least wanted to accept. Morrison hadn't worked alone. Someone else in Salem knew about the underground facility, about the missing children, about the systematic horror that had been carried out beneath their feet, and if that person was still alive, still in a position of authority or influence, then Carl's evidence might disappear just as surely as those children had. Carl started his truck and drove slowly through the streets of Salem, his mind racing as he tried to decide who he could trust. The current police chief, Martin Rodriguez, had only been in Salem for about 10 years, arriving well after Morrison's retirement. But what about the officers who had been on the force during the original investigation? What about the detectives who had searched the school and found nothing? Had they been incompetent or had they been deliberately looking the other way? The thought made Carl's stomach turn. Detective Frank Caruso had been the lead investigator on the Dorsey case, a respected veteran with 20 years of experience. Could he have been involved in the cover-up? Could he have known about Morrison's activities and helped conceal them? Or was Carl being paranoid, seeing conspiracies where simple human error might explain the failure to find the underground facility? Carl found himself driving past the Salem Police Department, a modest brick building that had been expanded several times over the decades to accommodate the growing force. Through the windows, he could see officers going about their daily routines, processing paperwork, answering phones, maintaining the facade of public safety that Carl now realized might be compromised from within. Instead of stopping, Carl continued driving, making his way through the residential neighborhoods where many of Salem's police officers and city officials lived. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt compelled to see these streets with new eyes, to wonder which houses might hide people who knew more than they had ever admitted about the missing children. It was while driving through the historic district, past the old colonial homes that had housed Salem's elite for centuries, that Carl spotted something that made him pull over to the curb. There, in the driveway of a well-maintained Victorian house, was a car he recognized from his days working at the school district. The vehicle belonged to Dr. Margaret Holloway, who had been the district's superintendent during the 1970s and 1980s. Dr. Holloway had been Morrison's immediate superior, the person responsible for overseeing his work as principal. She had been present during the initial investigation into the twins' disappearance, had spoken publicly about the district's cooperation with law enforcement, had assured parents that their children were safe in Salem's schools. If anyone would have known about irregularities in Morrison's behavior, about his access to the building after hours, about the construction work that must have been required to create the underground facility, it would have been her. Carl sat in his truck, studying the house where Dr. Holloway lived. She would be in her 80s now, long retired but still active in the community, according to the local newspaper's social pages. What did she know about Morrison's activities? Had she been complicit in his crimes, or had she been deceived along with everyone else? The decision to approach her wasn't one that Carl made consciously. He found himself walking up the brick pathway to her front door, the canvas bag slung over his shoulder, before he had fully considered what he would say. But as he raised his hand to knock, he realized that this conversation would determine not just the fate of his evidence, but possibly his own safety as well. "Doctor." Holloway answered the door herself, a small woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Carl's appearance. She wore a cardigan sweater despite the mild October weather, and her hands showed the slight tremor that often accompanies advanced age. But her voice was strong and clear when she spoke. "Can I help you?" Carl introduced himself, explaining that he worked for the school district and had been conducting safety inspections at the abandoned Hawthorne Elementary building. He watched her face carefully as he mentioned the school, looking for any reaction that might reveal hidden knowledge or guilt. But Dr. Holloway's expression remained neutral, professional, the same mask of composed authority that she had worn throughout her career in education. "I see," she said. "And what brings you to my door? Surely any concerns about the building should be directed to the current administration." Carl took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would irrevocably commit him to a course of action from which there might be no safe return. "I found something at the school, Dr. Holloway. Something related to the Dorsey twins." The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been fear or guilt, or simply the pain of old memories. Her grip tightened on the doorframe, and Carl noticed that her hands were no longer trembling. "I think you'd better come inside," she said quietly. Dr. Holloway's living room was a shrine to her career in education, with photographs of school events and retirement ceremonies covering every available surface. Carl recognized many of the faces from his own time in the Salem school system, teachers and administrators who had shaped the lives of countless children over the decades. And there, in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, was a photograph of Dr. Holloway standing beside Principal Morrison at some long-ago school function. "You said you found something related to the Dorsey case," Dr. Holloway said, settling into an antique armchair that seemed too large for her small frame. "May I ask what?" Carl opened the canvas bag and withdrew one of Morrison's notebooks, the one containing the detailed observations about Amanda and Rachel. He placed it on the coffee table between them and watched as Dr. Holloway's face went pale. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her professional composure cracking completely. "In a room beneath the school," Carl replied. "A room that was part of an extensive underground facility that someone spent years constructing. A facility where Principal Morrison conducted experiments on kidnapped children." Dr. Holloway closed her eyes, and for a moment Carl thought she might deny everything, might claim ignorance or express shock at the revelations. Instead, she began to speak in a voice so quiet that Carl had to lean forward to hear her. "I suspected," she said. "God help me. I suspected something was wrong, but I never thought it could be something so terrible." The story that Dr. Holloway told over the next hour painted a picture of a community that had failed its most vulnerable members through a combination of willful blindness and institutional protectionism. She had noticed irregularities in Morrison's behavior during the late 1970s, his tendency to work late hours alone in the building, his unusual interest in certain students, his requests for maintenance work that seemed unnecessary or excessive. But Morrison was a respected educator, a pillar of the community whose methods had earned praise from parents and colleagues alike. When Dr. Holloway had raised concerns with the school board, she had been told that she was being overly suspicious, that Morrison's dedication to his work should be celebrated rather than questioned. "There were other things," Dr. Holloway continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Children who seemed afraid of him, though they could never articulate why. Parents who mentioned behavioral changes in their children after spending time with Morrison, but he was so careful, so convincing. He had explanations for everything." The breaking point had come in 1983, 5 years after the Dorsey twins disappeared. A maintenance worker had reported finding disturbing items in Morrison's office, photographs of children that had no legitimate educational purpose, and notebooks filled with psychological observations that went far beyond what a principal would normally record about students. Dr. Holloway had confronted Morrison directly, demanding an explanation for the materials. His response had been calm, measured, and utterly chilling. He hadn't denied the accusations. Instead, he had explained his research in clinical terms, describing the children as subjects in a longitudinal study of behavioral development under stress. He spoke about it as if it were legitimate scientific work, Dr. Holloway said, her voice breaking, as if those children were laboratory animals rather than human beings. And when I threatened to call the police, he reminded me that I had been his supervisor throughout the period when the crimes were committed. He said that any investigation would reveal my failure to protect those children, my negligence in not recognizing what was happening under my watch. The threat had been effective. Dr. Holloway faced a choice between exposing Morrison's crimes and destroying her own career, between seeking justice for the missing children and protecting the reputation of the school district she had spent her life building. She had chosen silence, convincing herself that Morrison would retire quietly and that his research would end without further victims. I told myself I was minimizing the damage, she said, tears streaming down her weathered face. I thought if I could force him into retirement, if I could ensure he never had access to children again, that would be enough. I convinced myself that the children who had already been taken were beyond help, and that my priority had to be preventing future victims. Morrison had indeed retired in 1984, accepting an early retirement package that allowed him to leave the school system with his reputation intact. The underground facility had been sealed, the entrance hidden behind false walls and forgotten maintenance areas. The evidence of his crimes had been left to decay in the darkness beneath Hawthorne Elementary, along with the bodies of the children who had suffered and died there. But he didn't stop, did he? Carl asked. Though he already knew the answer from the dates in Morrison's notebooks, Dr. Holloway shook her head. I don't know. I tried not to know. After he retired, I made it my business to avoid any information about what he might be doing, where he might be living, whether there were other victims. I told myself that my responsibility ended when he left the school system. Carl felt a mixture of pity and rage as he looked at the elderly woman before him. She had been in a position to stop Morrison, to save the children who had disappeared after 1983, to bring justice to the families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Instead, she had chosen the path of least resistance, prioritizing institutional reputation over human lives. Where is Morrison now? Carl asked. I don't know, Dr. Holloway replied. After he retired, he moved away from Salem. I heard rumors that he had gone to Florida, or perhaps California, but I never tried to verify them. I never wanted to know. Carl realized that Dr. Holloway's ignorance about Morrison's current whereabouts might be genuine, but it also meant that the former principal could be anywhere, possibly continuing his twisted research in a new location with fresh victims. The thought made Carl's determination to see justice done even stronger. There's something else, Doctor, Holloway said, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison wasn't the only one. During my last few years as superintendent before I retired in 1989, I began to notice similar patterns in other districts, other schools, missing children, unexplained disappearances, administrators with unusual behavioral profiles. I think what Morrison was doing, I think it was part of something larger. The implication hit Carl like a physical blow. If Dr. Holloway was right, if Morrison's underground laboratory was just one node in a larger network of predators and facilities, then the scope of the conspiracy was far beyond what Carl had imagined. How many other schools harbored similar secrets? How many other children had vanished into underground chambers, where they became subjects in twisted experiments? You have to understand, Doctor, Holloway continued. This was before the internet, before the kind of communication networks that exist today. If there was coordination between different groups, different locations, it would have been much harder to detect. But looking back, the patterns were there. Too many missing children, too many cases that went cold, too many administrators who seemed to know more than they were saying. Carl's mind raced as he tried to process this new information. If Morrison had been part of a larger network, then exposing his crimes might be just the beginning of a much more extensive investigation. But it also meant that there were other people, other conspirators, who had a vested interest in keeping these secrets buried. Who else knew? Carl asked. In Salem, I mean, who else knew about Morrison's activities? Doctor. Holloway hesitated, and Carl could see her weighing the consequences of revealing more names, more connections that might implicate other respected members of the community. Finally, she spoke. Detective Caruso knew something was wrong. He came to me several times during the 1980s, asking questions about Morrison, about his access to the school building, about maintenance work that had been done without proper authorization. But I discouraged his inquiries, told him that Morrison was above suspicion. I think Caruso suspected there was a cover-up, but he could never prove anything. This revelation provided Carl with a glimmer of hope. If Detective Caruso had suspected Morrison all along, if he had been frustrated by the lack of cooperation from school administrators, then he might be an ally in bringing the truth to light. Caruso would be retired now, but he might still have contacts in the police department, people who would listen to his concerns and take Carl's evidence seriously. "Is Caruso still alive?" Carl asked. "Yes, I believe so. He lives in Marblehead now, retired but still active in various community organizations. He was a good man, Carl. If anyone can help you see that justice is done, it would be him." Carl gathered the notebooks and photographs back into his canvas bag, his mind already planning his next move. But as he prepared to leave, Dr. Holloway caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for such a frail-looking woman. "You need to be careful," she said. "If Morrison was part of a larger network, if there are others who are involved in covering up his crimes, then exposing the truth could put you in danger. These people have kept their secrets for decades. They won't give them up without a fight." Carl nodded, understanding the warning, but also knowing that he had no choice but to continue. The faces of Amanda and Rachel Dorsey, preserved forever in Morrison's horrific collection, demanded justice. The other children who had suffered and died in that underground chamber deserved to have their stories told, their murders acknowledged, their killers brought to account. "There's one more thing," Dr. Holloway said as Carl reached the door. "Morrison kept detailed records of everything he did. If he's still alive, if he's still active, those records might contain information about other facilities, other conspirators. Finding Morrison might be the key to exposing the entire network." Carl left Dr. Holloway's house with a clearer understanding of the scope of the conspiracy he had uncovered, but also with a growing sense of the danger he faced. The evidence in his possession could destroy lives and careers, could expose crimes that powerful people had worked for decades to conceal, but it could also save future victims, could prevent other children from suffering the fate that had befallen Amanda and Rachel Dorsey. As he drove through the streets of Salem toward his next destination, Carl realized that his investigation had reached a critical juncture. The decision he made in the next few hours would determine not just whether justice was served for the victims of Morrison's crimes, but whether the larger network of conspirators would finally be exposed or would continue to operate in the shadows, claiming new victims with each passing year. The sun was setting over Salem as Carl made his way toward Marblehead, where Detective Frank Caruso waited, unaware that his decades-old suspicions about Principal Morrison were about to be vindicated in the most horrific way possible. Frank Caruso's house in Marblehead sat on a quiet street overlooking the harbor, a modest Cape Cod-style home that reflected the careful savings of a career police officer. Carl found the address in the phone book and drove past the house twice before working up the courage to park and approach the front door. The weight of the evidence in his canvas bag seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if the truth itself was a physical burden he could barely carry. It was past 8 o'clock when Carl finally knocked, the October evening bringing an early chill that made him pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders. Through the window he could see warm light spilling from what appeared to be a den or study, and the blue flicker of a television screen. This was a home where someone had settled into comfortable retirement, away from the darkness and violence that had defined his working years. The man who answered the door was smaller than Carl had expected, though still carrying himself with the alert posture of someone accustomed to danger. Caruso's hair had gone completely white, and his face bore the lines that came from decades of seeing humanity at its worst, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent as they assessed the stranger on his doorstep. "Frank Caruso?" Carl asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Depends who's asking," Caruso replied, his tone neutral but wary. Even in retirement, the instincts of a cop were never far from the surface. Carl introduced himself, explaining his work with the school district and his discovery at Hawthorne Elementary. He watched Caruso's expression change as he mentioned the old school, saw something that might have been recognition, or perhaps just painful memory flash across the retired detective's features. "You'd better come in," Caruso said, stepping aside to let Carl enter. "But I have to warn you, If this is about what I think it's about, it's going to be a long night. Caruso's study was a shrine to his law enforcement career, with commendations and photographs covering the walls alongside shelves filled with case files that he had apparently kept after retirement. Carl noticed that several of the files were marked with missing person cases from the 1970s and 1980s, including a thick folder labeled Dorsey, Amanda and Rachel that sat prominently on the desk. "I never stopped working that case," Caruso said, noticing Carl's attention. "Officially, it went cold after the first year. Unofficially, I kept following leads, kept asking questions, kept trying to find answers for those girls' parents." "What did you find at the school?" Carl opened his canvas bag and began removing the evidence piece by piece. Morrison's notebooks, the photographs from the underground chamber, the costume fragments that had been hidden behind the auditorium mirror. He watched Caruso's face as each item was revealed, saw the retired detective's professional composure gradually give way to something that looked like vindication mixed with profound sadness. "Jesus Christ," Caruso whispered as he examined one of Morrison's clinical notebooks. "Jesus Christ, I knew something was wrong with that bastard, but I never imagined anything like this." The story that Caruso told over the next 2 hours filled in the gaps that had plagued Carl since his discovery. The retired detective had indeed suspected Morrison from the early days of the investigation, but his suspicions had been based on instinct rather than evidence, on subtle inconsistencies in Morrison's behavior rather than concrete proof of wrongdoing. "It was little things at first," Caruso explained, pouring coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting too long. "Morrison was too helpful, too eager to provide access to the school, too quick with explanations for things that shouldn't have needed explaining. When someone's genuinely innocent, they usually have questions of their own, you know? They want to understand what happened, how it could have occurred in their building. Morrison never asked questions, he just provided answers." Caruso had noticed other irregularities as well. Morrison's explanation for his whereabouts during the crucial evening hours didn't quite add up when checked against witness statements. The principal claimed to have been greeting parents and supervising the party, but several witnesses placed him away from the main gymnasium during the time window when the twins had disappeared. "And then there were the maintenance records," Caruso continued, his voice growing more animated as he recalled details that had bothered him for decades. Morrison had authorized extensive electrical and plumbing work in the basement areas of the school during the summer of 1978, just a few months before the twins disappeared. When I tried to interview the contractors who had done the work, I found that most of them had left town or couldn't be located. The investigation had been hampered from the beginning by what Caruso now recognized as deliberate obstruction from the school administration. Dr. Holloway had restricted his access to personnel files, claimed that certain maintenance records had been lost or misfiled, and generally made it clear that the school district's cooperation had limits that Caruso was not allowed to exceed. "I knew there was a cover-up," Caruso said, his frustration still evident after all these years. "But I was a small-town detective investigating respected members of the community. My own department was getting pressure from city officials to wrap up the case, to stop disrupting the school system with what they called unfounded suspicions. After the FBI left town with no new leads, the case was effectively closed. But Caruso had never stopped investigating, never stopped gathering information about missing children and suspicious disappearances in the greater Salem area. His unofficial files contained details about dozens of cases spanning several decades, all involving children who had vanished without trace from schools or community events where Morrison or similar administrators had been present. "Look at this," Caruso said, pulling out a hand-drawn timeline that covered the years 1970 to 1985. "Every red mark represents a missing child case in Essex County. Every blue mark represents a time when Morrison or one of his associates was involved in educational conferences, training sessions, or consulting work in those communities. The correlation was striking. Almost every missing child case coincided with documented presence of Morrison or other administrators who had worked closely with him. The pattern suggested a level of coordination and planning that went far beyond the work of a single predator operating alone. Morrison wasn't just taking children from his own school," Caruso explained. "He was part of a network, a group of educators who shared information and resources, who helped each other identify and acquire subjects for their twisted research. They used educational conferences and professional development programs as cover for their activities, traveling to different communities to scout potential victims. Carl felt sick as he realized the full scope of what Morrison and his associates had accomplished. They had infiltrated the very institutions that were supposed to protect children, had used their positions of trust and authority to gain access to the most vulnerable members of society. And they had done it all under the cover of educational professionalism, hiding their crimes behind a facade of academic research and child development. "How many children are we talking about?" Carl asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Caruso consulted his timeline, counting the red marks that represented young lives cut short. "In Essex County alone, I've documented 43 missing children cases between 1970 and 1985 that fit the pattern. Nationwide, if my suspicions are correct, we could be looking at hundreds of victims." The number was staggering, representing a scope of evil that Carl's mind struggled to comprehend. How could such a massive conspiracy have operated for so long without detection? How could so many children have vanished without someone connecting the dots, without someone recognizing the pattern that seemed so obvious in retrospect? "You have to understand the context," Caruso said, as if reading Carl's thoughts. "This was before computer databases, before the kind of information sharing that exists today. Each case was investigated by local authorities who rarely communicated with other jurisdictions. Missing children were often assumed to be runaways, especially teenagers. And the perpetrators were careful to spread their activities across wide geographic areas, making it almost impossible for any single investigator to see the full picture." Caruso pulled out another file, this one containing photographs and biographical information about Morrison's known associates in the education field. Carl recognized some of the names from his own time in the school system, respected administrators and researchers who had published papers on child psychology and educational methodology. Dr. Robert Henley, former superintendent in Newburyport. Dr. James Crawford, principal of 3 different elementary schools in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Dr. Sarah Martinez, director of student services for the state education department. All of them worked closely with Morrison at various times. All of them had access to detailed information about children in their districts, and all of them were present in communities where children subsequently disappeared. The photographs showed ordinary-looking people, the kind of middle-aged professionals you might see at any school board meeting or parent-teacher conference. Nothing in their appearances suggested the monstrous activities that Caruso suspected they had engaged in, but Carl was beginning to understand that the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared most normal, most trustworthy, most dedicated to the welfare of children. "Where are they now?" Carl asked. "That's the problem," Caruso replied grimly. "Most of them are still alive, still living comfortable retirements on their educators' pensions. They've never been investigated, never been charged, never faced any consequences for what I believe they've done. They're protected by their reputations, by the statute of limitations, and by the simple fact that proving their crimes would require evidence that has been buried for decades." Carl thought about the underground chamber beneath Hawthorne Elementary, about the preserved bodies and the detailed records that Morrison had kept. If similar facilities existed beneath other schools, if other members of the network had maintained similar collections of evidence and victims, then proof of their crimes might still exist. "We need to find Morrison," Carl said. "If he's still alive, if he still has access to his records, he might be the key to exposing the entire network." Caruso nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Finding Morrison is just the first step. Even if we locate him, even if we can prove what he's done, we're still dealing with a conspiracy that may extend to the highest levels of the educational establishment. These people have had decades to cover their tracks, to establish alibis, to create plausible explanations for their activities." The retired detective pulled out a more recent file, one that contained newspaper clippings and internet printouts from the past few years. "I've been tracking Morrison since his retirement. He moved to Florida in 1985, bought a house in a retirement community near Tampa. For a while he seemed to be living a quiet life, playing golf and attending community events. But then, about 5 years ago, he started becoming active in local schools again." Carl's blood ran cold as he read the newspaper clippings that Caruso had collected. Morrison had volunteered as a tutor for at-risk children, had offered his services as an educational consultant for struggling schools, had even established a private foundation that provided scholarships for underprivileged students, all activities that would give him renewed access to vulnerable children. "He's still active," Carl said, the reality hitting him like a physical blow. "He's still hunting." "I'm afraid so," Caruso confirmed, "and he's not alone. I've been monitoring the activities of several other members of the network, and they've all found ways to maintain contact with children despite their official retirements. Volunteer positions, consulting work, private foundations. They've created new opportunities to continue their activities." Carl stared at the evidence spread across Caruso's desk, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the challenge they faced. How could two men, one a retired detective and the other a school janitor, hope to expose a conspiracy that had operated successfully for decades? How could they bring down a network of predators who had embedded themselves so deeply in the educational establishment that they had become virtually untouchable? "There's something else," Caruso said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something I discovered just last month that made me realize how urgent this situation has become." The retired detective pulled out a final file, this one containing recent missing person reports from the Tampa Bay area. Carl's hands trembled as he read the details. 3 children had disappeared from different schools in the past year, all of them fitting the same profile that Morrison had preferred in his earlier victims. Young, vulnerable, from families that might not immediately be believed if they reported suspicious behavior from a respected community volunteer. "He's started again," Carl said, the words barely audible. "Or maybe he never stopped," Caruso replied. "Maybe he just got better at hiding his activities, better at avoiding detection. But the evidence suggests that Morrison and possibly other members of the network are still active, still taking children, still conducting their twisted research." The realization that Morrison's crimes were ongoing, that children were suffering and dying while he lived comfortably in retirement, filled Carl with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his rational thinking. But it also strengthened his resolve to see justice done, no matter what the personal cost might be. "What do we do?" Carl asked. Caruso leaned back in his chair, looking every one of his 70-plus years as he contemplated the magnitude of the task before them. "We do what I should have done 20 years ago. We gather every piece of evidence we can find, we build an airtight case, and we take it to the FBI. But this time we don't go through local channels. We don't trust anyone who might have connections to the educational establishment. We find someone clean, someone with the authority and resources to investigate a conspiracy this large." The retired detective pulled out a business card that looked like it had been handled many times. "Special Agent Rebecca Walsh, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. She's a specialist in crimes against children, and she's been tracking similar patterns of disappearances nationwide. If anyone can help us expose this network, it's her." Carl studied the business card, understanding that Carl spent the night in his small apartment above the hardware store, sleeping fitfully when sleep came at all. Every sound from the street below made him jolt awake. Every car that passed too slowly made him wonder if Morrison's associates had already tracked him down. The canvas bag sat beside his bed like a ticking bomb, filled with evidence that could destroy lives and careers, evidence that powerful people would kill to keep buried. At 6 in the morning, Carl gave up on sleep and called Frank Caruso. The retired detective answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the early hour, suggesting that he too had spent the night wrestling with the implications of what they had uncovered. "I've been thinking," Caruso said without preamble. "We need to be smart about how we approach Agent Walsh. If we just call her office, leave messages, wait for callbacks, we give the network time to respond. We need to get to her directly, face to face, before anyone else knows we're making contact." Caruso had already researched Agent Walsh's schedule, using contacts he still maintained within law enforcement to track her movements. She was scheduled to testify in a federal case in Boston that morning, which meant she would be at the courthouse by 9 o'clock. If Carl and Caruso could intercept her there, they could present their evidence in person, away from the potentially compromised channels of official FBI communication. "Pack everything," Caruso instructed. "Original documents, photographs, the costume pieces you found, everything. And bring copies too, hidden somewhere separate. If something happens to us, if we disappear or have accidents, at least there will be backup evidence for someone else to find." Carl spent the next hour making photocopies of Morrison's notebooks at a 24-hour copy center, his hands shaking as he fed page after page of horrors through the machine. The clinical descriptions of torture and murder, the detailed psychological profiles of victims, the careful documentation of experiments that violated every principle of human decency, all of it was now duplicated and hidden in various locations around Salem. The drive to Boston took almost 2 hours, with Caruso navigating the morning traffic while Carl sat in the passenger seat, the original evidence bag clutched in his lap like a lifeline. Neither man spoke much during the journey, both lost in contemplation of what lay ahead and the very real possibility that they might not survive the day. The federal courthouse in Boston was the imposing granite structure that had been dispensing justice for more than a century. Carl and Caruso arrived early, positioning themselves near the main entrance where they could observe everyone who entered or left the building. Agent Walsh was easy to identify when she arrived at 8:30. A tall woman in her 40s, with the alert bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with the worst examples of human behavior. Caruso approached her as she climbed the courthouse steps, his retired detective's badge visible in his hand as he made the introduction. Carl watched from a distance as the conversation unfolded, seeing Agent Walsh's expression change from polite interest to sharp attention as Caruso explained the nature of their evidence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Agent Walsh nodded and gestured for Carl to join them. She led them to a small conference room within the courthouse, away from the public areas where their conversation might be overheard or observed. "Detective Caruso has given me a brief overview of what you've discovered," Agent Walsh said, her voice professional, but tinged with the wariness that came from investigating too many false leads and conspiracy theories. "Before we go any further, I need to see some evidence. I need to know that this isn't elaborate fantasy or misinterpretation of innocent materials." Carl opened the canvas bag and withdrew Morrison's most damning notebook, the one containing detailed observations about Amanda and Rachel Dorsey's final days. He watched Agent Walsh's face as she read, saw her professional skepticism gradually give way to horror, and then to the cold fury of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting children. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl told the story of his discovery at Hawthorne Elementary, describing the hidden chamber behind the auditorium mirror, the underground facility with its rooms full of evidence and victims, the preserved bodies that had been arranged like trophies in Morrison's collection. With each detail, Agent Walsh's expression grew more grim, more determined. "This fits a pattern we've been tracking for years," she said finally. "We've suspected the existence of an organized network operating within educational institutions, but we've never had concrete evidence. We've had missing children, suspicious disappearances, educators who seem to have unusual access to vulnerable students, but nothing that would stand up in court." Agent Walsh explained that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been investigating reports of coordinated predatory activity in schools across the country for more than a decade. They had identified several suspicious patterns: missing children who fit specific profiles, educators who moved frequently between districts, conference circuits that seemed to correlate with disappearances in multiple states. "But we could never prove coordination," Agent Walsh continued. "We could never demonstrate that these were connected crimes rather than isolated incidents. What you found, Morrison's records, his documentation of methodology and victim selection, this could be the key to exposing the entire operation." Caruso spread his timeline across the conference table, showing Agent Walsh the correlation between Morrison's activities and missing children cases across New England. She studied the pattern with the trained eye of someone who had spent years looking for connections that others missed, and Carl could see her professional excitement building as she recognized the significance of what they had uncovered. "This is bigger than just Morrison," she said. "If your timeline is accurate, if these correlations hold up under investigation, we're looking at a conspiracy that may involve dozens of perpetrators across multiple states. The logistics alone would require extensive coordination and planning." Agent Walsh pulled out her phone and began making calls, speaking in code words and abbreviations that Carl didn't understand, but which conveyed the urgency of the situation. Within minutes, she had assembled a team of FBI investigators who were already en route to Boston, ready to take possession of the evidence and begin what she described as the largest investigation into crimes against children in Bureau history. But as they waited for the federal agents to arrive, Agent Walsh shared information that made Carl's blood run cold. The Bureau had been monitoring communications from several suspected network members, including electronic surveillance that had detected unusual activity in the past 24 hours. "Someone knows that evidence has been discovered," she said grimly. "We've intercepted phone calls, encrypted messages, travel reservations that suggest the network is implementing some kind of emergency protocol. They're moving to protect themselves, which probably means eliminating evidence and witnesses." The implication was clear. Carl and Caruso were now in immediate danger. By uncovering Morrison's underground chamber, by making contact with law enforcement, they had triggered a response from people who had successfully covered up their crimes for decades and who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. "We're going to need to place both of you in protective custody," Agent Walsh said, "at least until we can arrest the key members of the network. These people have resources, connections, the ability to make problems disappear. You won't be safe until they're behind bars." Carl felt a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect of federal protection. Relief that he wouldn't have to face Morrison's associates alone. Terror at the realization that his normal life was effectively over. There would be no going back to his quiet job as a janitor, no return to the anonymity that had defined his existence for so long. The FBI team arrived within an hour, a group of serious-faced agents who took possession of Carl's evidence with the careful precision of people who understood its significance. Agent Walsh introduced them as specialists in organized crime and crimes against children, investigators who had been tracking pieces of this conspiracy for years without realizing how the pieces fit together. Special Agent David Chen, the team leader, explained that the Bureau would be launching simultaneous operations in multiple states, targeting suspected network members before they could destroy evidence or flee the country. The timeline would be compressed, with arrests happening within days rather than weeks, to prevent the conspiracy from covering its tracks. "We've been building cases against several suspects for years," Agent Chen said. "What you've provided gives us the missing connections, the proof of coordination that we needed to move forward. But we're racing against time now. Every hour we delay gives them more opportunity to eliminate evidence and protect themselves." The investigation would be massive, involving hundreds of FBI agents across multiple field offices. They would search properties associated with suspected network members, looking for underground facilities similar to what Carl had found beneath Hawthorne Elementary. They would examine financial records, communications, travel patterns that might reveal the scope of the conspiracy. But most importantly, they would attempt to locate and arrest Edward Morrison before he could disappear into the network of safe houses and protected identities that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. "Morrison is the key," Agent Walsh explained. "He's been documenting this network's activities for decades. If we can capture him alive, if we can convince him to cooperate, he could provide information about facilities, victims, and conspirators that we might never find otherwise." Carl learned that the FBI had already located Morrison's current address in Florida, a modest ranch house in a retirement community near Tampa. Surveillance teams were moving into position, preparing for a coordinated arrest that would happen simultaneously with raids on other suspected locations across the country. "What about the children who might still be captive?" Carl asked, thinking about the recent disappearances that Caruso had documented in the Tampa area. Agent Walsh's expression darkened. "That's our primary concern. We are treating this as a hostage situation with multiple unknown locations." The next several hours passed in a blur of briefings and planning sessions as the FBI prepared for what Agent Chen described as the most complex multi-state operation in Bureau history. Carl and Caruso were moved to a safe house outside Boston, where they provided detailed statements about their discoveries and answered questions from investigators who were building cases against dozens of suspected conspirators. If Morrison or other network members realize they're about to be arrested, they might take steps to eliminate witnesses, including any children who are currently being held. But even as Carl felt the machinery of federal law enforcement mobilizing around the evidence he had uncovered, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. Morrison's network had operated successfully for decades, had infiltrated educational institutions across the country, had managed to make hundreds of children disappear without detection. Such an operation required more than just careful planning and coordination. It required protection from within law enforcement itself. "Agent Walsh," Carl said during one of their briefing sessions, "how do we know there aren't network members within the FBI? How do we know that information about this investigation isn't already being passed to Morrison and his associates? The question clearly troubled Agent Walsh, though she tried to hide her concern. "We've compartmentalized the investigation," she said. "Only a small number of agents know the full scope of what we're doing, but you're right to be concerned. A network this sophisticated, this well-protected, almost certainly has connections within law enforcement. The possibility that Morrison might already know about the investigation, that he might be preparing to eliminate evidence and escape justice, made the next few hours feel like an eternity." Carl found himself staring at his phone, waiting for news from the arrest teams, wondering if they would find Morrison's house empty or if the former principal would be waiting for them with decades of planning and preparation behind him. As evening approached, Agent Walsh received the call that everyone had been waiting for. The surveillance team in Florida had confirmed that Morrison was at his residence, apparently unaware that his underground laboratory had been discovered or that federal agents were closing in on him. "Teams are moving into position now," Agent Walsh reported. "Morrison should be in custody within the hour." But even as Carl felt a surge of hope that justice might finally be served, Agent Walsh's phone rang again. This time her expression changed from cautious optimism to alarm as she listened to the voice on the other end. "What is it?" Caruso asked, reading the concern in her face. Agent Walsh ended the call and turned to face them, her professional composure barely concealing her frustration and anger. "Morrison's house is empty. Not just empty, cleaned out, as if he knew we were coming. The surveillance team says it looks like he left in a hurry, probably within the last few hours." The realization hit Carl like a physical blow. Despite all their precautions, despite the compartmentalized investigation and careful security measures, Morrison had somehow learned about the discovery of his underground chamber. He had vanished into whatever network of safe houses and protected identities had kept him hidden for so long, taking with him the secrets that could have exposed the entire conspiracy. "But that's not the worst part," Agent Walsh continued, her voice grim with implications that Carl didn't want to contemplate. "We found evidence at Morrison's house that he wasn't working alone in Florida. There are recent photographs of local children, surveillance equipment, documentation that suggests he was preparing to take new victims. The investigation that Carl had hoped would end with Morrison's arrest was just beginning. Somewhere in the darkness, the network that had protected him for decades was mobilizing to eliminate evidence and witnesses. And Morrison himself, the man who held the keys to exposing the entire conspiracy, had vanished like a ghost, leaving behind only the promise that his twisted research would continue in some new location, with some new group of innocent victims. Agent Walsh's phone rang again, and this time her expression shifted from frustration to something approaching panic. "There's been another development," she said after ending the call. 3 children in the Tampa area have just been reported missing. All of them disappeared within the last 6 hours, right around the time Morrison would have realized he was being hunted. The message was clear. Morrison hadn't just escaped. He had taken hostages with him, innocent children who would serve as leverage to ensure his continued freedom. And somewhere in the vast network of underground facilities and safe houses that had protected the conspiracy for decades, those children were beginning to experience the same horrors that had befallen Amanda and Rachel Dorsey more than 20 years before. The race to stop Morrison and save his newest victims had begun, but the former principal had a decades-long head start and resources that the FBI was only beginning to understand. As night fell over Boston, Carl realized that his discovery of the underground chamber had been just the first move in a deadly game, whose rules he was only beginning to comprehend. The manhunt for Edward Morrison began immediately, with FBI teams coordinating across multiple states as they traced financial records, vehicle registrations, and communication patterns that might reveal where the former principal had taken his newest victims. But Morrison had spent decades preparing for this moment, and every lead seemed to evaporate as quickly as it appeared. Agent Walsh established a command center in the Boston field office, with banks of computers displaying real-time intelligence about suspected network members and their known associates. Carl and Caruso remained under protective custody, but they were kept informed of developments as the investigation expanded into what Agent Chen described as the largest coordinated search for missing children in FBI history. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analyzing Morrison's abandoned house in Florida, forensic specialists discovered that he had been careless in his haste to escape. Hidden beneath layers of newer construction, they found access to another underground facility, smaller than the one beneath Hawthorne Elementary, but containing evidence that would prove crucial to tracking him down. Morrison didn't just have one laboratory, Agent Walsh explained during a briefing call. He's been building them wherever he goes, creating a network of facilities connected by tunnels and hidden passages. The Florida site contains maps, construction plans, financial records that show how the network operates. The documents revealed that Morrison's organization had been far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. They had purchased properties in dozens of communities across the country, always focusing on locations near schools or youth centers. Each property had been carefully modified with underground facilities connected by tunnels that allowed movement without detection. But most importantly, the records contained current addresses and communication codes for active network members. The FBI now had targets for simultaneous raids that would happen at dawn, designed to capture conspirators before they could destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. Carl learned that one of those targets was Dr. Margaret Holloway, the former superintendent who had helped cover up Morrison's crimes. Despite her apparent cooperation during Carl's visit, she had been secretly communicating with network members, warning them about the investigation and helping coordinate their response. "She's been feeding information to Morrison since the day you found the underground chamber," Agent Walsh said grimly. "Her house has been under surveillance for the past 24 hours, and we've intercepted communications that suggest she knows where Morrison is hiding." The dawn raids were executed with military precision, with federal agents hitting targets in 12 states simultaneously. Dr. Holloway was arrested at her Salem home, along with 3 other suspected network members who had been living quietly in the community for decades. But it was the raid on a seemingly abandoned warehouse outside Hartford, Connecticut, that provided the crucial intelligence breakthrough. Hidden beneath the warehouse, agents discovered an active facility that contained not only evidence of ongoing crimes, but also clear indications of where Morrison had taken his latest victims. Communication equipment found at the site revealed that the network maintained contact through a series of coded radio transmissions, and FBI technicians were able to trace recent signals to a location in the mountains of Vermont. "We have him," Agent Chen announced during an emergency briefing. "Morrison's holed up in what appears to be the network's primary facility, a compound in the Green Mountains that's been under construction for more than 20 years. And according to the intelligence we've gathered, he's not alone." The Vermont facility was described as the crown jewel of Morrison's operation, a massive underground complex that served as both a research laboratory and a training center for new network members. Built into the side of a mountain and accessible only through hidden entrances, it had been designed as a fortress that could withstand law enforcement assault while protecting the network's most valuable assets. "Satellite imagery shows the compound can house up to 50 people," Agent Walsh explained. "We believe Morrison has taken refuge there along with other senior network members and their current victims. The children who disappeared from Tampa are almost certainly being held there, along with others who may have been captive for weeks or months." The assault on the Vermont compound required careful planning and coordination between multiple federal agencies. The facility's underground nature and hidden entrances made traditional law enforcement tactics ineffective, while the presence of hostages meant that any rescue operation carried enormous risks. Carl found himself consumed with guilt and anxiety as he waited for news of the assault. His discovery of the evidence beneath Hawthorne Elementary had set in motion events that had led to this moment, but he couldn't escape the feeling that the children currently held by Morrison were suffering because of his actions. If he had found a way to expose the conspiracy quietly, if he had worked more carefully to avoid detection, perhaps those children would never have been taken. Agent Walsh seemed to understand his torment. "So you couldn't have known how Morrison would react," she told him during one of their conversations. "And if you hadn't found that evidence, if you hadn't been brave enough to come forward, this network would have continued operating indefinitely. Whatever happens now, you've saved countless future victims." The assault on the Vermont compound began before dawn on a cold November morning, exactly 1 month after Carl had first discovered the costume pieces behind the auditorium mirror. FBI tactical teams approached through the forest, using thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar to locate the hidden entrances that provided access to the underground facility. What they found exceeded even their worst expectations. The compound contained multiple levels carved deep into the mountain, with sophisticated ventilation systems, independent power generation, and communication equipment that allowed coordination with similar facilities around the world. This wasn't just an American conspiracy, it was part of an international network that had been operating for decades. But most importantly, they found the children. 12 victims in total, ranging in age from 8 to 14, including the 3 who had been taken from Tampa during Morrison's escape. All of them were alive, though traumatized by their experiences and in need of immediate medical attention. Morrison himself was captured in what appeared to be the facility's command center, surrounded by decades of documentation about the network's activities. At 74 years old, he appeared frail and confused, no longer the imposing figure who had once commanded respect in Salem's educational community. But his capture provided investigators with access to records that would take months to fully analyze. "We've hit the mother lode," Agent Chen reported during a call to the command center. Morrison kept everything: financial records, membership lists, construction plans, victim profiles. This documentation goes back to the 1960s and includes operations in at least 30 states and multiple foreign countries. The scope of the conspiracy that Carl had accidentally uncovered was staggering. The network had included hundreds of educators, administrators, and other professionals who had used their positions to identify and acquire victims for research that combined elements of psychological experimentation, behavioral modification, and simple sadistic pleasure. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that the network had been expanding its operations in recent years, using internet communication and social media to coordinate activities and share information about potential victims. Morrison's capture had effectively decapitated the American branch of the organization, but international connections suggested that similar operations continued elsewhere. The arrests continued for weeks as FBI agents worked through Morrison's records, identifying network members and raiding properties across the country. Many of the suspects were elderly, retired educators who had spent decades living quietly in their communities while harboring secrets that would have shocked their neighbors. Dr. Margaret Holloway eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators, providing testimony that helped fill in gaps in the documentary evidence. Her account of the network's history revealed that Morrison had been recruited into the organization during his early years as a teacher, gradually working his way up through the hierarchy until he became one of its most prolific operators. "They called it research," she testified during one of her debriefing sessions. "They convinced themselves that they were advancing scientific understanding of child psychology and behavior. But it was really just an elaborate justification for systematic abuse and murder." The legal proceedings that followed Morrison's capture stretched on for more than 2 years, with trials in multiple jurisdictions as prosecutors worked to bring justice for victims spanning several decades. Morrison himself was ultimately convicted on charges that carried multiple life sentences, ensuring that he would never again pose a threat to children. But for Carl Jenkins, the resolution of the legal cases provided only limited satisfaction. The children who had been rescued from the Vermont compound would require years of therapy and support to recover from their experiences. The families of victims like Amanda and Rachel Dorsey had finally received answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but those answers came too late to ease decades of pain and uncertainty. Carl returned to Salem after the trials concluded, but he found that the town had been forever changed by the revelations about Morrison's network. Hawthorne Elementary remained abandoned, its underground chambers sealed, and the building itself scheduled for demolition. The community struggled to come to terms with the fact that such horrors had been occurring beneath their feet for so long without anyone noticing. The national media attention surrounding the case had brought unwanted scrutiny to Salem, with reporters and true crime enthusiasts making pilgrimages to see the locations where the network had operated. Carl found himself reluctantly thrust into the public eye as the man who had exposed one of the largest conspiracies in American history, a role that he neither wanted nor felt equipped to handle. Agent Walsh stayed in touch with Carl long after the investigation concluded, partly out of professional interest in how he was coping with the aftermath of his discovery, but also out of genuine concern for someone who had risked everything to protect children he had never met. She helped him understand that his actions had prevented countless future victims, that the network's expansion plans would have led to even greater horrors if they hadn't been stopped. "You have to understand," she told him during one of their conversations, "networks like Morrison's don't just fade away on their own. They grow, they recruit new members, they refine their methods. If you hadn't found that evidence, if you hadn't been brave enough to come forward, we might never have discovered what was happening." The international investigation that grew out of Morrison's capture continued for years, with law enforcement agencies around the world working to identify and dismantle similar networks. The documentation found in the Vermont compound provided leads that resulted in arrests and rescues in dozens of countries, saving children who might otherwise have suffered the same fate as Amanda and Rachel Dorsey. But Carl knew that the victory was incomplete. Morrison's network had been vast and sophisticated, with connections and resources that couldn't be completely eliminated. Somewhere in the world, other facilities probably remained active. Other conspirators continued their twisted research. Other children suffered in underground chambers, while the world above remained oblivious to their plight. On Halloween night, 5 years after his discovery at Hawthorne Elementary, Carl stood in the auditorium where everything had begun. The building was scheduled for demolition the following week, and he had been granted permission for one final visit to the site that had changed his life forever. The mirror where he had found the costume pieces was gone, replaced by a memorial plaque that listed the names of all the victims whose bodies had been recovered from the underground chamber. Amanda and Rachel Dorsey's names were at the top of the list, but they were followed by dozens of others, children whose disappearances had mystified their communities for decades. Carl thought about the night 27 years earlier, when two 12-year-old girls had walked through these doors in their Halloween costumes, excited about a party that would become their final public appearance. They had trusted the adults who were supposed to protect them, had believed that their school was a safe place where nothing terrible could happen. The irony wasn't lost on Carl that he had been a student at this same school during the early 1970s, that he had probably walked past Morrison in these same hallways without realizing that he was in the presence of a monster. How many other children had Morrison observed and evaluated during those years, wondering which ones would make suitable subjects for his twisted research? But Carl also thought about the children who had been rescued from the Vermont compound, who were now receiving therapy and support as they worked to rebuild their lives. Their rescue wouldn't undo the trauma they had experienced, wouldn't erase the memories of their captivity, but it gave them the chance to heal and grow and eventually find happiness despite what they had endured. As Carl prepared to leave the auditorium for the last time, he noticed something that he had missed during all his previous visits. Carved into the wooden stage, barely visible in the dim light, were two small initials, AD and RD. Amanda and Rachel Dorsey had left their mark on this place, a final message from two little girls who had refused to be completely erased by the evil that had consumed them. Carl knelt beside the initials, running his fingers over the carved letters that represented lives cut tragically short but not forgotten. The twins would never know that their disappearance had ultimately led to the exposure of a conspiracy that had claimed hundreds of victims, that their suffering had finally been given meaning through the rescue of other children who might otherwise have shared their fate. Outside the auditorium, Carl could hear the sounds of Halloween celebrations beginning throughout Salem. Children were preparing for trick-or-treating, putting on costumes and preparing to venture out into the darkness in search of candy and fun. Their parents would watch over them carefully, alert to dangers that previous generations had never imagined, aware that monsters could hide behind the most respectable facades. The legacy of Morrison's network would live on in the form of increased vigilance, better communication between law enforcement agencies, and enhanced protection for the children who represented society's most vulnerable members. It was a small comfort, but it was something tangible that had emerged from the darkness of the underground chambers. Carl left Hawthorne Elementary that night, knowing that he would never return, that the building would soon be reduced to rubble, and the site transformed into something that might bring healing rather than horror to the Salem community. But he also knew that the memories of what he had discovered would stay with him forever, a reminder that evil could hide in the most unexpected places and that ordinary people sometimes had to make extraordinary choices to protect the innocent. As he drove through the streets of Salem, past houses where children were preparing for Halloween adventures, Carl understood that his life had been fundamentally changed by his discovery of the truth behind Amanda and Rachel Dorsey's disappearance. He was no longer the anonymous janitor who preferred shadows to spotlight, no longer someone who could hide from the complexities and dangers of the world around him. But he was also someone who had made a difference, who had chosen courage over safety, who had ensured that the victims of Morrison's network would finally receive the justice they deserved. It wasn't enough to bring back the children who had died in those underground chambers, but it was enough to give their deaths meaning and to prevent countless others from sharing their fate. The cycle of horror that had begun in Salem on Halloween night 1978 had finally ended 27 years later, on another Halloween night when the truth was finally complete. Amanda and Rachel Dorsey could rest in peace, knowing that their story had been told and their killer brought to justice. And somewhere in the darkness, other children who might have become victims were safe because one man had refused to look away when confronted with evidence of unspeakable evil. The mirror behind which Carl had found the first clues was gone, but its reflection would live on in the form of vigilance, justice, and the determination to ensure that such horrors never again remained hidden in the shadows where predators thought they could operate with impunity. The twins' final Halloween had lasted 27 years, but it was finally over.